Okay, this is the last section of this World Bank report on principles of adaptation to climate change. We will go through the ideas on actually what's involved in applying these principles. It's great to learn about the theory, the principles, and so on. Even though we looked at some toolboxes and some models for estimating impacts of climate change on GDP and so on, we had some indicators and key questions to ask and so on. It is really where the actual application that happens that will teach you many more things about what may be needed to change in terms of adjusting the principles or prioritizing them, implementing them, and then comes the tricky part of monitoring progress, especially since adaptation for the longer term timescales may become so expensive and so irreversible that we have to do things very, very carefully, especially in terms of keeping uncertainties in mind in terms of the future risks for which we are adapting. And it's not always possible to change what we implemented if it's a hard structure. For example, if a state in India decided to put $1 billion into putting offshore windmills and then the winds died in 10 years, what do you do? So these are tricky things. So lead ministries here could be finance, economy, and ministry or agency in charge of climate change often fits under environment. So India had incredibly strong winds blowing, and I'll see how bad the sound is. India had a ministry called Ministry of Environment and Forest, and now it has become Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So it has evolved over time. India also evolved a Ministry of Earth Science about maybe 20 years ago, which does a lot of the climate labs, including meteorological forecasts and climate forecasts. But climate change has been put with an environment and forestry. Okay. The earlier sections of this guide have argued that an effective climate change adaptation strategy needs to comprise measures to ensure a broad, productive, and inclusive development pathway, which we looked at in the section on foundations, and actions in four priority areas covering adaptation of people and firms in priority area 1, land use plans, public assets and services in priority area 2, residual risk management in priority area 3, and macro fiscal risk management in priority area 4, which was the last section. So maybe I should stop and see if the sound is really bad, but let me go for a few more minutes. I'll re-record if it's really bad. Here is a figure that is showing schematically 6 actions to effectively implement an adaptation and resilience strategy. Action A.1, I have a lot of winds. Creating a strong institutional and legal framework with appropriate stakeholder involvement. Stakeholder involvement is always critical, even though I've discussed this in the context of how IPCC evolved the scenarios where politicians had undue influence, I would say in my mind, on defining global warming targets like 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, and modelers bent over backward to fit them into potential pathways that can get us there by 2100, which some of them are just simply not realistic. Okay, so co-production has great value just in terms of applicability and acceptance by the stakeholders, but also we have to be sure that science maintains its epistemic ownership, production ownership, right? Action A.2 here, design an adaptation and resilience strategy with prioritized actions. So unlike other actions we have looked in all the previous sections, we can see a loop here which is very critical for iterating with stakeholders and so on to come back with final decisions. Action A.3 in this sense is set concrete sector level targets to guide implementation by line ministries. Obviously, this will involve adaptation of agriculture, infrastructure, maybe banking systems, procurement of grains and distributions, transportation transportation, energy, and so on, right? Action 8.4 gets feedback from 8.3 to screen all public policies and expenditures for climate and disaster risks and align them with adaptation targets, which then leads to action 8.5, allocate appropriate funding to the adaptation strategy. And 8.6 comes next to say track progress over time and review and revise the strategy. This is critical. Review and revise the strategy so that you have an adaptation plan, management plan, and not something that's fixed. How well this can work when hard structures like seawalls or moving people are involved, that's tricky, right? This then feeds back to designing an adaptation and resilience strategy with prioritized actions. So in some sense, you may decide on a strategy and actions and then start implementing. By then, it's maybe not possible to have this feedback loop all over again. What is action 8.1 then? Create a strong institutional and legal framework with appropriate stakeholder involvement, as we said. The policy actions discussed across this report require an appropriate institutional and legal framework so that people who are forced to make decisions or displaced and so on have to have legal recourse. Such changes are usually introduced through climate change framework laws. So there's another report that I won't go through here. These framework laws have multiple roles, from establishing short and long-term climate change targets to creating the institutional and legal framework needed to ensure that climate change is properly addressed. There are many required changes which are discussed in multiple places in this report. For example, most climate change framework laws have a knowledge or data component to ensure that climate change related information is available to the public and private decision makers. So that's action 1.1 we had seen in priority area 1. There are three important components for creating a strong institutional legal framework. Okay, what are they? Adjusting the mandate of existing ministries, agencies, and institutions. So considering resilience and climate and disaster vulnerability must be made part of the existing mandates to ensure these issues become part of good governance. Computing vulnerabilities is not easy, needs a lot of data at sufficient granularity in space and time, and this is not always possible. But when it is possible, it shows some many interesting things. For example, over many parts of India, natural hazards have become more frequent, but vulnerabilities have dropped because of various factors like educating women, for example. So these kinds of things allow vulnerability to be reduced with specific actions once the key items in vulnerability and exposure, for example, are identified, because often you cannot do much about hazards, which is a global issue in terms of climate change, right, and emissions. Okay, keeping that in mind, this is particularly important for infrastructure services. For example, regulating public and private power providers can help increase power systems' resilience to storms and droughts. And when developing rules for budget preparation and discussions and financial or banking regulations, these are now discussed before in action 4.1 and 4.4, which you can go back and look at. NGFS here is the network for greening the finance system that we talked about. Considering climate and disaster risks in land use planning, which we looked at, adapting land use plans and public infrastructure and critical services to climate change impacts. So considering climate and disaster risks in land use planning should also be included in the mandate of municipalities or authorities in charge of developing land use plans and delivering building permits. So we don't have the luxury of simply relying on economic activities to keep expanding and developing land use plans. We have to constantly make well-informed, risk-informed decisions on land use plans and building permits, even legal codes for the buildings and so on. Creating new agencies or committees where needed, although it's generally preferable to build on existing institutional design to prevent conflicts and contain costs, governments will sometimes have to create new agencies or institutions to implement an action. So we are seeing no-analog situations and regulations of past may not work anymore, and institutions to implement new regulations have to be brought in, or set up. But while infrastructure resilience may be coordinated by a small committee placed under the Prime Minister or Minister of Economy, the design and implementation of the measures is better left to the existing regulators of infrastructure services. Leaving, for example, regulations on the resilience of power system to the regulators of said power system will prevent cross-agency conflicts and improve consistency in regulations and investments. Whenever you bring change, if one agency that's been dealing with it is surprised by it or sees as its power being encroached upon, then there can be resistance and delays which would be bad for adaptation. Okay, but where there is an institutional vacuum, for example an absence of watershed agencies to manage water allocation at the right spatial scale, the challenges around climate change and natural risks provide additional rationale for strengthening institutions, including by creating new agencies. So some strong storm came and seemed to have dissipated. So Mumbai has, even though you think of Mumbai as having orographic rain, it actually has lots of convective systems and moving storms because it's at the northern edge of the southwesterly flow, and even though it's at the foothills of the Western Ghats at the coast, the rainfall systems here are quite different. Establishing an overarching coordinating body, designing and implementing an adaptation and resilience strategy often requires coordination mechanism to ensure consistency in actions across sectors and ministries. This is horizontal coordination, and across national, regional and local tiers of governments, which is vertical coordination. Ensuring coordinated action across entities can help capture synergies and take care of important roles like M&E and progress tracking, monitoring and evaluation. To be effective, the mechanisms must include representation at a senior, typically agency head level, to give it the necessary authority and access to the required resources after decisions are made. Since adaptation and resilience are highly cross-sectoral, the mechanism is also best placed at the center of government, for example with a committee chaired by the Presidency or Prime Minister's office or the head of a planning or central finance agency. Several proposals exist, including the creation of a national risk board or chief risk officers. So each country will be doing this on its own terms and its own history and culture, so hopefully they are all effective in terms of coordinating the adaptation activities. So let me stop this here and make sure the sound is okay before we proceed to the next podcast, even though this is already 13 minutes. If I have to re-record it, it's going to be some work. Okay, nonetheless,